Welcome, as this is my 100th review, and to celebrate I decided I would review the only game I had yet to finish in one of my favorite series, the original Team Silent Hill, with the very first game on the PS1, and being on the PS1 was the major factor for that. Because while I find the PS1's history and its games endlessly interesting, I do find it to be a console that I'm not very fond of having to go back to, as I don't really have nostalgia for it being a product just before my time, and so a lot of its flaws are just a bit too much for me. Even in the best games in the console, like Metal Gear, like Silent Hill, like Final Fantasy, and Crash Bandicoot. And despite how good these games are, there is a clear feeling that there's a level of clunkiness to it all, which I primarily presume is from the scope of the games when compared to the power of the hardware. PS1 games were very ambitious in their design, in part because of how much data CDs can hold, and how at that time it was a lot of data comparatively to its competitors, the N64, and beyond that, even the ability to use multiple CDs, and that paired with the fact that the PlayStation was underpowered when compared to the Nintendo 64, it meant that games would have this fully realized worlds, but then the characters would look like they were made of giant triangles because, well, they are. Mario's round cheeks couldn't run on the PS1, and Final Fantasy VII's world wouldn't fit on a Nintendo cartridge. And so what ended up happening is developers getting really creative with the platforms, and Silent Hill is maybe one of the best examples of that. The first Team Silent game, a team of misfits and rejects from Konami who had failed on other projects, and this is for them like a final thing that they had to do before they got the boot. And so came Silent Hill in a very similar story to the Final Fantasy one, in a way of what would be someone's last chance for a game, then turned into a massive success. And in this particular situation, really showing the power of letting your developers and creatives have, well, creative liberty rather than trying to imitate what's been done before. A lesson that unfortunately Konami would never learn, and that would lead to the eventual disbandment of Team Silent after Silent Hill 4, a game that wasn't even meant to be a mainline Silent Hill game, not to be confused with the idea that is often spread around that it wasn't meant to be related to Silent Hill at all. But we're not here to talk about the ending, but the beginning of Silent Hill from 1999, also the year that I was born. And so we will start with the story, and here this game is already weird as it starts after a car crash we only see glimpses of during the opening montage cutscene before we even get to the main menu. And is in this montage that you get to see our main character Harry Mason driving with his daughter in the car at night until a young girl gets in the middle of the road, causing an accident as Harry swerves to try and avoid her. It's also during this cutscene we see Sybil and subsequently her crashed bike, immediately giving us an idea purely through this opening cutscene of how outsiders end up in this mysterious town that is Silent Hill. And as the game starts, you wake up here, stuck and with your daughter nowhere to be seen, in a town covered in fog and out of season snow. Or is it? Well, yes, it is. Over the years, and especially propelled by the movie, was the idea that the fog and snow in the games was actually ash and smoke from the fires. And while that could have even worked through the symbolism, through the story of the game, to the point where I actually don't think it would have been a bad idea if they had done it, it just happens to not be the case. The town many think Silent Hill was inspired by, Centralia, wasn't even a place the developers were aware of. Then the snow has its own meaning, and the fog, well, everyone knows that story. Brought upon as a solution to the complaint of playtesters that the city would pop in right in front of them due to the low draw distance that the PS1 was limited to be able to run this game. Yup, that's a callback. But regardless, getting back to the plot, as you start looking for your daughter, you will start encountering monsters and realize that you seem to also be locked inside of Silent Hill. And this becomes more apparent as you encounter other people in the town like Sybil, or more correctly in this situation, she finds you, the policewoman, who also gives you your first weapon. Sybil is an interesting character in the fact that she might not be an instrumental character to the plot, but while still being a very needed one, as she adds the moments of sanity in this otherwise, well, insane journey. As other characters in this game, more often than not, bring upon more dread. For example, a character I really like in this game, Lisa, who is a nurse at the hospital you are exploring, as initially she seems much like Sybil, a character that's also stuck in a bad situation, but as you learn more about her and her past, without spoiling, well, things go back to being depressing. And the game does this well in a very diegetic way, with notes and books in the game in a way that is concise but while still feeling realistic to the world of the game. Like being written in the first person or books relating to the puzzles. A lot of the puzzles here are explained through abstract poems, and also adding to that is also how these are often presented, like for example notes written in blood and how that adds to the horror, but more on that in the graphics and also gameplay a bit. But getting back once again to the plot, as you progress through the story you are led around Silent Hill looking for your daughter as you deal with the monsters, and in that way this is where you really feel that this is the first game. A lot of it just doesn't feel as purposeful. It feels as if you're running around the town and accidentally uncovering a cult plot while trying to find your daughter. And of course, these are ultimately one and the same, but that feeling prevails, even if that also comes with the feeling of being lost and kinda scared, which does add to it, but the way it's handled here might not be the best. As here you're sent around from location to location under the pretense that you might find something, like you go to the school and then you might find something, and then you go to the hospital and you might find something there, and then when you are in these locations looking for your daughter, these areas can end up feeling just like puzzles more than locations, which I think later games end up handling it a lot better. That being said, something that was here from the beginning is the meaning in these locations and the story they tell using the locations. I already mentioned the school, so I'll use it as an example, which is an important location because it tells us about the past of one of the most important characters in the whole Silent Hill franchise. Or for example, the hospital that tells us the story of Lisa, and we see her perspective on the events of the game, while still very much pushing the story forward, and in that way it's really good. It is at the end of the day a very intriguing story of the occult, and I will say here, from the perspective of someone who has played the other games before it does miss on some of the symbolism relating the characters to the world that I think make the sequel so special, but there is a lot of hints of it already here, to the point where even if I hadn't liked this game, it would be impossible for me to ignore the fact of how influential it is for the later games in the series. And overall, what is here is still really good, it's great. Yeah, the dialogue is awkward, and even if it's intentional, it doesn't quite work like once again it does in its sequels. But once again, well, there is just so much going on for it already that it's easy to ignore, as the best part of Silent Hill's story are usually in the details. Final actual thing I want to say though about the story, now relating to having played Silent Hill 3 before this one, is how much appreciation I have gained for both games having played this one. As you may know, Silent Hill 3 is a direct sequel to this game, and for me it recontextualized a lot of scenes and areas in Silent Hill 3, and I just thought that was a cool little thing. You know, obviously sequels should add up to each other, but you know, I didn't realize how well it did it, and I thought that would be a cool thing to mention. Moving on finally then to the gameplay, and Silent Hill is very much a survival horror game with sort of fixed camera angles. The camera does have fixed angles, but it also has somewhat free moments where you can affect it, like for example while exploring Silent Hill streets. But the movement of the camera is also used for the purpose of unsettling the player and creating a feeling of unease, like something is wrong, with purposefully strange positioning and odd angles. And while cool, this does translate to a lot of shooting or attacking enemies off screen, which I'll be the first to say that the combat here is not great. This is not Resident Evil, and to be fair, it's not supposed to be. Harry is just some dad with a gun and a crowbar, not Chris Redfield. And speaking of guns, here the roster is rather small. During your main playthrough, you'll mostly find 3 the gun given to you by Sybil, the shotgun, and then the rifle that can be found in the world. But the thing is, you can also easily miss them if you don't explore, so I recommend exploring because this is it, this is what you get. But also it does cover the gambit of the guns you expect to see in a game like this fairly well. Once again, it's important to remind that the combat is not the focus. In fact, you are encouraged to just avoid combat when possible, as to conserve ammo and health. And in that way, yes, being very much like some early Resident Evil games. In terms of melee weapons though, there is a surprisingly variety, but they exist in that way that once you find a new one, it will make the last one somewhat useless. So finding a new one is more of a straightforward upgrade, as it usually adds damage and, more importantly, reach. Because here keeping a distance is one of the most important things, as enemies' main dangerous move is to grab you, allowing other monsters to get close in the meantime and do the same, which adds a level of risk when trying to run, which once again seems like it might have been taken from, a Resident Evil game. But I will say that surprisingly the variety of enemies here seems to be much greater. And this one is one of those things that Silent Hill does really well, with each area having its own unique enemies that keep in theme. And to avoid a spoiling, I'll use the same examples I've been using thus far. The elementary school has knee-high creatures that run around with a knife, so I'll let you figure out what that means. Then the hospital with what is probably the most straightforward designs, with these deformed nurses and doctors that kinda mumble around until they sense you like a zombie. I will say something that is done here, and I believe it was at the time unique to the Silent Hill series, was the use of sound to tell the status of a room and its enemies. Once you enter a room, the radio you get early on will sound off static if there is an enemy in the room, immediately give you an idea of the situation even if the camera angle doesn't. And so once you kill them, the sound will stop. This being important because sometimes putting an enemy down doesn't mean he is dead. Also, monsters themselves let out noises, and for example, an alive enemy that is down will still make noise once it's shot, but because of the radio, this is really a bit of a redundant feature, even if it is a cool detail. That being said, I'm glad that these mechanics are here, because like I said before, it addresses the weird camera angles that the game really needs to tell its story and, more important, convey that feeling of horror. Now moving on to another facet of the gameplay, the puzzles here usually are divided in areas. Like the school will be its own big puzzle, as solving one puzzle really just unlocks the key to another. And they're satisfying enough. I feel bad for saying it, but they're satisfying in that same way all the Resident Evil games are. I know I'm mentioning Resident Evil a lot, just slightly more complex here. I will say it can almost border on moon logic, but I will say it's not, since once you resolve a puzzle, the logic does make sense here. And it never gets to horseshoe wax and a lighter levels of weird. I think a lot of it is just because there is that horror and fear on the back of your hair that is messing with you, and in that way I guess it really succeeds on the psychological horror front. That being said, there is this one about counting legs that I will not spoil, but it is absolute BS. It makes sense, but the idea of reaching that conclusion when there are so many other ideas throwing you off with the way that the puzzle is presented, it is a bit annoying. Also the way you input the solution in that specific puzzle, which can lead you to think that you're doing something wrong if you don't realize what you can interact with. This is probably one of the biggest flaws of Silent Hill, and that is sometimes not knowing what you can interact with. Most objects of interest do stand out from the scene, but sometimes you can open certain cabinets and these don't stand out, blending quite well into the environment. And the thing is, sometimes these have items that are the most important to the story, being the ones that lead you to the good ending. And one of the things about Silent Hill is that it has two endings, with each one having an extra scene if you do a certain action. The thing is, these actions are actually moon logic. Like the whole water bottle thing suffers from that finding items problem. Like this water bottle is just sitting on a table, but it just looks like part of the background and not like other items you can interact with. And this problem is at its worst when getting the good ending is already a process of having to deviate from the main path that the game is pushing you through. And I'll be honest, if I wasn't aware of these endings before going into, I would have probably just gotten the bad ending. And it's not a satisfactory ending regardless of how interesting it may be. And because of the idea it gives the player, I don't think it would incentivize you to play it again. So I will say right now, look up a guide if you want a good ending. You can still try and figure it out on your own, as I do think that the path to the good ending is fairly intuitive, and if you are aware of the cabinet thing during that moment, then you'll probably figure out on your own fine enough. Even for the extra scene, the item you use makes sense in the moment, it's just that acquiring the item itself happens so much earlier in the game, and I personally think would be almost impossible to find it out besides just stumbling upon it on accident. But anyways, I rambled a bit here, but it is some of the more important parts of the overall game and your experience with it, and I mention it more to warn the new player who might be getting into this game for the first time like me. And overall the gameplay is better than younger me made it out to be, as I have tried this game well in the past and I just could not get into it with the controls. But getting into it now, I didn't really mind it, and it makes me want to go back and maybe try some other tank control games of the time. And tank controls is the way to go here. While this game does have analog support, it is finicky and weird, not the way to go. And I say this as someone who played and preferred the other Silent Hill games with analog controls. But those were PS2 and this one is very much a PS1 game, which leads us then to talk about the graphics. And honestly, it still looks amazing in my opinion. I have said before that the Silent Hill original series is one of the most amazing looking games ever. I think they look good to this day. I would wholeheartedly say that Silent Hill 2 through 4 don't need remakes. Well, a remaster wouldn't hurt. Oh wait. Anyways, Silent Hill 1 though is its own beast, of course, especially since I went on about how the PS1 was the underpowered console. But it doesn't really matter because, as we also established, its shortcomings are also some of its strongest assets. Obviously the fog being the one everyone talks about, and for good reason. The fear of the unknown, the less you see, the more you fear, are some of the most fundamental ideas of horror, and here they just kinda come with the territory. Not to say that's the only thing it does well. Obviously another hallmark of Silent Hill that started here is the world and how it changes around you as it turns into the other world with the metal and the rust and the feeling of confusion and distortion as this world does not follow the laws of physics. I'll let you figure out what that means, but regardless, creating a feeling of being lost and confused, creating a panic, so to say, as you try to figure out your situation while also trying to survive. It's a game that, despite its age, is still capable of scaring, and that may be because of how most of the horror I described so far has an effect primarily psychological, and for me at least, that's one of the most effective types of horror. Another thing adding to this factor is our next topic, soundtrack, and there isn't anything quite like Silent Hill in this regard, with what can only be described as a cacophony of industrial sounds, metal clanking and screeches, creating a deeply unsettling sound as it intensifies the more you progress into this world, and that contrasted with the more melodic and often sad sound of the piano and the distorted guitar for the more emotional moments. And I'll be honest, this is one of my personal favorite soundtracks of all time. It is not only great, but also is the push to make the game truly a nightmare. Silent Hill would not be the same game without it. And to finish this review with a horrible segue, the world would not be the same without Silent Hill either. Its influences on the horror genre echo to this day, and while not perfect, it is an amazing game in its own regard. And for that, Silent Hill is getting a 9 out of 10. It is now one of my favorite PS1 games If not my favorite, I need to replay Metal Gear. But anyways, recommendations wise, well, the obvious one here is if you're looking for a horror game and if controls and frame rate of PS1 games don't bother you, then 100% give this one a try. But if you are a younger gamer or just someone who can't adapt to the older sensibilities of these games, which is totally fair, then maybe consider playing another Silent Hill game. 2 would be my recommendation, as hint hint, that game is a 10 out of 10 in my book. But if you are like me and you were putting this game off for the longest time because you just don't do well with tank controls and older games, then I urge you to at least try it out. Trust me when I say you will get used to it and its kinks, and it will be worth it, as this is a Silent Hill game and they don't make them like this anymore. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking and commenting, all the things you can do for free, and especially since this is the 100th game review on this channel after almost a year of uploading. And it's been fun, except for when I get behind schedule, but no matter, it's taught me quite a lot about the internet and making content online, but hopefully it's also not the end, as I do think there is still a lot more to experience here, and I definitely hope to try other and new things, so we will see. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.